Hi there, friend. My name is John Werner. I used to be a part of the largest cult in the United States. After studying the Bible, Christian history, and ministry, I set my sights on confronting the problematic nature of white evangelicalism in the United States. In 2019, I published my first book as a first step in addressing the subtle issues of this complex system. This podcast will continue that work under the same title. Welcome to The Cult of Christianity. Hi there, friend. Welcome to this special episode of the podcast. In this episode, I'm sharing a recording of a presentation that I gave at the Global Center for Religious Research's Atheism E-Conference that took place on March 4th of this year. The presentation was titled, "The Only Stopping Religious Trauma is Journalism." In this presentation, I argue for the importance of journalism in combating religious trauma. I mentioned that journalism can help to expose the harmful practices of religious groups, as well as tell the whole story rather than just some of its parts. There's a brief Q&A where some of my presentation is challenged and I respond. I share some award-winning journalism and express my opinions about the mistakes broader media makes in covering religion. I hope you enjoy this episode, and I encourage you to check out the Global Center for Religious Research's website for more information about the conference and the speakers who were featured there, as well as the work they're doing. Thank you for listening.
John Werner is an up-and-coming religious reporter and host of the Cult of Christianity podcast. His reporting includes church investigations, propaganda watchdogging, and religious trends. He is known for his long-form interviews of cult survivors, religion specialists, and pastors. We're really lucky to have him here. So, John, thank you so much for doing this. You have the floor.
Thanks so much, Darren. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hope no technological mishaps happen. So hopefully everyone can see what I want them to see. It's an honor to be here. I'm much less an academic. I'm a journalist. So I rely on everyone else to be an academic so that I can profit off of their work by summarizing it. In all seriousness, I'm very passionate about this. I believe that the only stopping religious trauma is journalism, and I'm going to make an argument for why that is the case. I would say most of this is opinion, not necessarily fact, so feel free to disagree with me and be critical of everything I have to say. So, the North American Committee on Religious Trauma Research, which is formed by our GCRR, says that religious trauma results from an event, series of events, relationships, or circumstances within or connected to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is experienced by an individual as overwhelming or disruptive and has lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So let's break that down. We've got events, we've got relationships, and we've got circumstances. One of the things I do as a journalist is when I hear words, I have to ask questions. Journalists ask a lot more questions than they answer. And so when it comes to events, who hosts events? When it comes to relationships with who? And circumstances, what kind of circumstances? Well, when it comes to events, we're talking about religious structures, systems, and institutions. Those are the ones hosting these events. When we talk about relationships, we're talking about people from those religious structures, systems, and institutions. And when we talk about circumstances, you guessed it, what kind? Those manufactured by religious structures, systems, and institutions. Why does that matter? Well, let's look at what happens in different religious trauma settings with some examples. So religious structures can communicate to children that certain kinds, or sometimes all kinds, of sexual attraction to others is sinful. And then you have people who exit that structure. In 2020, the Journal for Scientific Study of Religion strongly associated queer identity with a decision to attend church less frequently or stop going altogether. A religious news service said the decision to leave one's faith often begins not with feeling rejection from others, but with questioning Christian values. So if you're a queer person or any person who just experienced sexual shame within a religious structure, what remains? Well, let's go back to that definition of religious trauma: lasting adverse effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. This can look like panic attacks during sex. This can look like a hesitancy to come out if you're queer. It can also result in a lot of imposter syndrome, which looks something like, I don't know if I'm doing this quite right. There's a lot of uncertainty of all the shame that came from that religious structure. Let's look at another example, finances. So lots of religious structures will encourage a tithe, or some of them encourage even more than a tithe to their institution. And they'll use rhetoric to promise that giving money will reap rewards here or in an afterlife. Ex-Scientologist Vance Woodward tried suing the Church of Scientology, claiming that he was psychologically manipulated and that organization obtained $600,000 from him between 2007 and 2010. That's a bit of an extreme example, but this is actually a common theme, and many never recoup their losses, and they'll start a new life with less than zero. And so you go back to that religious trauma. What can happen after this experience? There can be financial illiteracy, just not very well educated on managing finances. There can also be the shame when splurging, like you're doing something wrong because you're not being a good steward or something like that. And there's this fear of being duped again. So you might be hesitant to give money somewhere because you're afraid that you'll get taken advantage of again. And we'll look at one more example. So most major religions and even minor cults have shame-embedded doctrines that imply or explicitly say that depression is a result of failure and happiness is a result of adherence to their ideology. So, in the predictive relationship of religious trauma and spiritual abuse on meaning-making, trust, and depression, it's a great study to read through if you like reading through studies. One section of that study that Cheryl Johnston was the head of states, in a study that included 353 participants, 1/3 of whom suffered sexual abuse by either a parent, a relative, a stranger, or a religious figure, those who were abused by parents and religious figures scored higher on both anxiety and depression scales. Severity and experience of depression for survivors of religious trauma and spiritual abuse are affected by the elements of coping, use of fear, the attachment to God, and health or medical community experiences. So what does that look like? There can be a fear of happiness or pleasure. Again, that goes back to this idea of an inability to trust, and most heartbreaking, often suicide ideation. So this is what religious trauma can look like. But what are the challenges to addressing religious trauma? Well, there's a very important structural challenge. There's this balance of good and evil. This quote is from my mentor, who's a Christian veteran religious reporter. He says that faith-based groups provide tutoring and shelter. They run schools and hospitals. They resettle refugees. They comfort the grieving and care for those in need. When crisis strikes, they come running to help. In Bob's book, it's called Reorganized Religion, and one of my favorite parts of it is he talks about religion as a load-bearing wall, especially when it comes to disaster relief. Those who are not religious struggle to organize sometimes and kind of create red tape, whereas religious institutions can often garner a lot of energy in helping people very quickly. So when you take that load-bearing wall away, what do you replace it with? And that's an important question as we look forward as a society. So that's kind of a structural challenge. Then you have this exiting challenge, because you have religion versus spirituality. And many who leave religious institutions are not actually leaving spirituality. They're just becoming more individualistic. They don't want to be associated with the institution as much. So the common word evangelicals, a lot of times they actually have more in common with theological liberalism than atheism. And so that's another problem, is parsing out those particular issues. And then you have this trauma challenge. How on earth do you parse trauma? For example, if your fundamentalist Christian father spanked you as a kid, what kind of trauma do you have? Are your PTS symptoms from violence? Are they from parental betrayal? Is it religious indoctrination? I mean, I certainly heard that you were supposed to, what's their phrase? Spare the rod, spoil the child. And so is that religious trauma? And does it really matter where this trauma came from? Is parsing it that important? Well, like any good journalist, I went to Google and I said, what to do about religious trauma? And my algorithm determined that I needed livingbetterlivesnwa.com's blog post that recommended breathwork, meditation, dance, yoga, and other physical exercises. And I'm like, okay, I guess I've tried some of that. Maybe I need to be dancing more. And then it has a little blurb on cognitive behavioral therapy. You know, therapy generally treats religious trauma kind of like other forms of trauma. And is that okay? I'm going to let a different expert answer that because I'm not a psychologist. What about research? That's something that we do here, right? So, any good journalist, I went to Wikipedia. And it says to date, most research on religious trauma has been qualitative research with an individualistic experiential focus. These have been interview-based or case studies from clinical practice. There have been a few quantitative stories, such as Milton's survey of 295 former exclusive brethren members, and she found the overall measure of psychological distress was significantly higher amongst the leavers when compared to the general population. Okay, that's interesting. Catherine Becker Blees, I hope I'm saying her last name correctly. She's a PhD. In her 5 tools for ethical trauma-focused research, she brings up the really important question. Can traumatized participants provide informed consent? Is trauma-focused research distressing? And is there an ethical issue? Must researchers report abuse? Because we need to know more, but we don't need to make anything worse. So therapy is good. I'm all for it. And research is good. Please keep doing it. So why do I say that the only stopping religious trauma is journalism? We have to look at a very, very big picture. So we have the structure. That's where power dynamics coupled with archaic or deceptive doctrines create the opportunity for abuse. So even if not everyone within a religious structure is an abuser, they're all definitely given opportunities for abuse. And because of that, you have abuse. And abuse is normalized, propagated, ignored, or denied. And it's a problem. So you have people who are in this structure of religious institutions, individuals, families, communities, and they'll either have to rationalize the abuse, they'll have to reject the abuse, or they'll have to find some other way to adjust to the structure's abuse. And no matter what decision they make, they're going to have trauma, consciously, subconsciously, or unconsciously. Trauma is stored in the body, mind, and spirit with an asterisk for those of us who don't believe we have a spirit. And then you have research and therapy that can address the trauma of individuals. Now, what I do want to point out is research can look at all of these sections, and it's needed in all of these sections. But good research requires a lot of being very specific. And so what ends up happening in the trauma field is the research is done on the trauma and the solutions to the trauma most often, or the first two, the structure and the abuse. And that's good. They should do that. And also with therapy, it can take into account the whole story for the individual, but therapy is very focused on the individual. So it's really moving through that story with the person in therapy. What I do, or try to do to the best of my ability, religious reporting deals with every stage of religious trauma, not just one stage or, 2 of those stages. It tries to deal with the whole picture. So I'm about to read an article or not the whole thing, but some quotes from an award-winning article. This received the Religious News Association's award for best journalism of, I believe, 2022, might be 2021. I think it was in 2022, but for 2021. It's called An Inconvenient Genocide: Why We Don't Know More About the Uyghurs. And first, let me just this summary is from Wikipedia. Again, a journalist's best friend. We are too lazy to actually do really good research. So, the Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group originating from and culturally affiliated with the general region of Central and East Asia. The Uyghurs gradually started to become Islamicized in the 10th century, and most Uyghurs identify as Muslims by the 16th century. Islam has since played an important role in Uyghur culture and identity. Since 2014, the Chinese government has subjected Uyghurs to widespread human rights abuses, including forced sterilization and forced labor. So that's what Tom is doing in this article. And he says human rights advocates see a parallel between the muted response to China's repression of the Uyghurs and America's failure to challenge Nazi moves against the Jews in the 1930s, a time when the United States had deep political and economic interest in Germany. Senior American officials, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt, hoped a conciliatory approach to Hitler would encourage Germany to continue payments on its multi-billion-dollar debt to U.S. creditors. Wall Street bankers were heavily invested in German industry and wanted to protect their stakes. Major Hollywood studios were omitting movie references to Jewish mistreatment in order to satisfy Nazi censors and maintain access to the important German film audience. In March 2021, a group of 32 prominent legal scholars, human rights experts, parliamentarians, and historians endorsed a report by the Newslines Institute and by the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. It concluded that the systematic efforts by Chinese communist authorities to destroy the Uyghur identity and diminish their separate existence in China met the legal definition of a genocidal campaign. Those Uyghurs whom officials see as unlikely to assimilate may be sent for re-education at detention camps. An investigation by Human Rights Watch in 2018 suggested that red flags for detention included traveling abroad or having contact with someone who did, speaking one's native language in school, or abstaining from alcohol or tobacco. One Communist Party propaganda message obtained by Radio Free Asia's Uyghur service explained that those Uyghurs chosen for re-education are actually ill, quote, infected with religious extremism and violent terrorist ideology, and therefore must seek treatment from a hospital as an inpatient. While Chinese authorities say that many Uyghurs sent to re-education centers have subsequently been assigned work in cotton fields and factories as part of a poverty alleviation program, human rights investigators insist that Uyghurs have little or no choice over whether to accept such work because the alternative is continued detention. Satellite photos show the factories are often located inside the detention camps, surrounded by high walls and barbed wire. Two formerly detained Uyghur women who cooperated with a BuzzFeed News investigation said they worked in locked cubicles on such tasks as sewing pockets on work clothes. They stayed in factory dormitories with as many as 16 women packed in a room, and in their spare time, they were expected to study the Chinese president's speeches. The grueling work of picking cotton by hand, meanwhile, was largely done by Uyghur prisoners or former prisoners. American consumers and consumerism bear a share of responsibility for such practices, insofar as they buy inexpensive clothing made in China over made in USA alternatives. A 2011 study by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco found that 36% of US consumer expenditures on shoes and clothing were for products made in China versus just 25% of apparel made in the US. And a further 2019 study suggested that the numbers continue to climb. It is virtually impossible to know for certain whether a particular t-shirt or pair of sneakers was produced through forced Uyghur labor, but items containing Chinese cotton are suspect. The United States and its allies eventually went to war against Nazi Germany, not to stop the genocide of the Jews, but because of Nazi military victories through Europe and the threat of Axis world domination. It is hardly conceivable that anyone will attack China in order to help the Uyghurs, and for that matter, the people of Tibet, the residents of Hong Kong, or Han lawyers or journalists and political activists held in China's prison. That's not even close to the whole article, so I'd totally recommend checking it out. It's very good. Here's the question. Do Uyghurs experience religious trauma and spiritual abuse? And as I like to say a lot for those who are fans of improv, yes, and. So before converting to Islam way back when in the 10th century, Uyghurs were diverse religiously. And China is officially an atheist country. But that doesn't prevent religious trauma. The Uyghurs who were forced to convert to Islam centuries ago are now persecuted for that very same religious identity. And because people are clever, the Chinese Communist Party is justifying these efforts with rhetoric implying that since Uyghurs were forced into Islam, they were never free to choose their own religion. So their re-education camps are an effort to help, not hurt, the Uyghur people. Well, the data shows otherwise. Why do I bring this up? Well, because journalism can confront actual religious persecution as effectively as it can confront religious abuse. Because journalists, or at least good journalism, deals with the whole story. Let's look at the runner-up from the same year. This will be slightly shorter. It opens, this is Julia Dune, the Christian prophets who say Trump is coming again. Perched on a cream-colored armchair, Johnny Inlow, a 61-year-old California-based Pentecostal pastor with short-cropped gray hair, a trim beard, and Tom Selleck-style mustache, looked into the camera and prophesied that Donald Trump would become president again. Not in 2024, in 2021. The January 20th inauguration date doesn't really mean anything, Inlow said in January 29th video, which has gotten north of 100,000 views on YouTube. According to Inlow, more than 100 other credible Christian prophets around the world had likewise declared that Trump, somehow, would be restored to power soon. Indeed, Inlow was not alone on that limb. Greg Locke, a Nashville pastor with a massive social media following, said after Trump's loss that he would 100% remain president of the United States for another term. Kat Kerr, a pink-haired preacher from Jacksonville, Florida, declared repeatedly last month that Trump had won the election by a landslide, and that God had told her he would serve for 8 years. In this video, Inlow went further. There's not going to be just Trump coming back, he said. There's going to be at least 2 more Trumps that will be in office in some way. Donald Trump, he proclaimed elsewhere, was the primary government leader of planet Earth. With only 2/3 of voters and 1/3 of Republicans expressing confidence that Biden won a free and fair election, many observers worry, rightfully so, that these prophets are sowing more confusion, blurring the line between misinformation and religious proclamation. They are spreading their message to wide audiences. Some preachers who amplify these prophecies have followings in the millions that increasingly exist in an echo chamber of like-minded religious YouTube channels, Instagram feeds, and websites such as Elijah List, host of the YouTube channel Elijah Streams, where Inlow's video aired. Political prophecies are a relatively recent phenomenon. Televangelist Pat Robertson, who ran for president as a Republican in 1988, occasionally prophesied everything from wars to Earth-destroying asteroids, but it was Trump who gave the movement a political focal point. Trump is seen by some charismatic Christians as chosen by God in spite of his faults. Prophets have said as far back as 2007 that the then real estate mogul would eventually land in the White House. In 2011, a retired Orlando firefighter turned prophet named Mark Taylor predicted Trump would be elected in 2012, and after Trump decided not to run, a few prophets predicted, incorrectly as it turned out, that Mitt Romney would win. The Brown is about to be referenced. That's just another prophet, self-proclaimed prophet, who is not a fan of this direction. Trump's wooing of evangelicals and charismatics made for a veritable flood of favorable prophecies during his presidency, in Brown's words. They range from Australian prophet Lana Vawser's May 2017 vision of Jesus clothing Trump with a purple robe and crown to Inlow's February 2020 assertion that the victory by the Kansas City Chiefs over the San Francisco 49ers in the Super Bowl that year had prophetic significance for, among other things, the fact that Trump is God sent and it is advancing a kingdom agenda. Inlow is one of several prophets who believe God speaks through major sport events. In a 2020 book, James Beverly, a research professor at Tyndale University in Toronto, tracks more than 500 prophecies about Trump by more than 100 prophets over a 15-year period and found a low batting average for accuracy. My research, Beverly told me, that would be told Julia, shows that the prophecies are usually vague, sometimes totally wrong, and with rare exception have failed to be properly critical of Trump. Yet even Brown admits these measures will go only so far given the extent to which the evangelical church has become entwined with Trump's strain of politics. How did we become so politicized, he wonders? How did so many of us end up with almost a cult-like devotion to a leader, compromise our ethics for a seat at the table, and drape the gospel in an American flag? So here's why I read all that. This is the question. Do people who believed prophets about Trump suffer from religious trauma? Yes. And Trump identifies as Christian, but he doesn't seem to know the gospel, the Bible, or much about Christian culture. So why do they identify with them? Well, according to Yale sociologist Philip Gorksky, white evangelicals love Trump because they are white Christian nationalists. White evangelicals were attracted by Trump's radicalized apocalyptic and blood-drenched rhetoric, precisely because it recalled an earlier version of American religious nationalism. White Christians in the United States have seen themselves as a protagonist of history, smiting the impure and clearing the land for virtue. For white people, Trump speaks to that particular white Christianity of empowerment, contempt, domination, and blood. So this is what's interesting that I've found in my work as a journalist. You actually can kind of withhold judgment about virtues while effectively showing evidence of religious abuse. Because again, we're dealing with the whole story. We're not so specific. We're telling stories. Let's go back to this whole picture again. In both those stories, there's structures, there's abuse, there's acceptance and rejection of that structure, and there's trauma. The solutions bit is interesting when we get to journalism because a lot of times we kind of pass the mic and say this is for someone else. And I think this is where research and therapy can do some things that journalism can't always do. But I think there's a implication in journalism that there are solutions. We're just careful not to focus so much on the solutions that we lose track of the whole story. But journalism needs to go farther than it has gone. Here's some problems. Some common mistakes that journalists make about American Christianity. One, evangelicals are not synonymous with conservative rednecks. Evangelicalism is a very wide umbrella, and that word gets misused a lot in media. Christianity is not persecuted. Another thing media can get wrong sometimes. Just acting like there's any kind of persecution, frankly, anywhere, but especially in the US. This is another just concept that journalists who aren't educated in religious issues get wrong. Most Christian worldviews of the day are not based in any biblical commands. When journalists try to write about the Bible, they think of the Bible as commanding something from Christians. That's not how most like Western American Christianity theology operates. Even self-admittedly, I would hope most of them would say they might use rhetoric about we're commanded by God to do this, but in general, it's pretty clear this is a systemic theology, a systemic reading of the Bible that developed much later. Racial dynamics in various denominations might mirror the irreligious world, but it's not identical. There's some very specific racial dynamics that are at play in Christianity that, again, can run parallel to just the racial dynamics of the country and the, frankly, just the prevalence of white supremacist ideology in so much of what we do. But there are very specific nuances within Christianity that not all journalists pick up on. And this is a pet peeve of mine. Christians are not especially stupid. They might say stupid things. They might do stupid things. There's nothing innate about being a Christian that makes you stupid. There's some very smart Christians. It's just not a helpful way of reporting, in my opinion, to just think that Christians are stupid, especially considering the amount of power they have Time would be better spent dissecting how that power got there than just calling them stupid. Here's some common mistakes that journalists make about Islam globally. First off, and I can't believe I still have to say this in 2023, Muslims overwhelmingly reject suicide bombings and other form of violence against civilians in defense of Islam. That is just should not be considered a defining characteristic of the Islamic faith. It's also really important to know that there is a distinction between Islamic ideology and Muslim identity. Those are two different things, and while they interact, it's important to keep those distinctions, especially if you're a journalist interviewing a Muslim, and the type of questions you're going to ask them is going to show whether you understand there's a distinction there. Here's another one. It's okay to call out misogyny and homophobia that's taught in Islamic ideology, in efforts to be neutral, to kind, and not encourage certain kinds of hate. Sometimes there's a hesitancy to call out misogyny and homophobia in religious ideology. It's okay to do that as a journalist, in my opinion. Most Muslims don't really know too much about Islam. This applies in some other religions too. Being Muslim is often a birth identity. And also, it is important to keep in mind that Americans are predisposed to hate Muslims, especially post 2001. Don't make it worse. In anything you do in reporting, don't feed into especially Christian hate, but American hate. Here's a lot of mistakes get made in reporting about Judaism. First off, criticism of Israel is not automatically anti-Semitism. There's no need to tiptoe around criticism of a country. A phrase that needs to be retired is Judeo-Christian God. There is no such thing as a Judeo-Christian God or value. They're completely separate religions. Let's retire that. Most American Jews are irreligious. I don't think all journalists pick up on that. I don't like the term, and I've my Jewish friends don't like the term ethnic Jew. It can be problematic, so just there's very easy ways to avoid that. Also, this is a big one for right now. Anti-Semitism is not resurfacing. It never went away. That hate for Jews has been around for just about as long as any kind of hate I can think of, and to say it was ever gone is not true. So that's what journalists can do better. Here's some really practical solutions. We need more journalists who are religiously informed. A lot just simply are not very educated on religion. And we also need less journalists who do not understand how to communicate religious nuances and just kind of go off the stereotypes in their heads. We need more courageous coverage of religious abuse and actual religious persecution, not talking about someone not getting a cake, talking about something that might be happening, like, say, with the Uyghurs. We also need less cowardly coverage that relies on stereotypes and false equivalencies, that there's somehow like all religious people are just one thing when it's clearly more diverse than that. This is a personal thing and something I try to live out. We need more boots in the ground in churches, cults, synagogues, and mosques. A lot of journalists are afraid to approach these holy places. I'm not. I think it's good to get in there and find your primary sources and not just rely on aftermath of events. We like like what I'm about to say, which is we need less mindlessly repeating of surveys and religious expert and calling it news. There's a place for that for sure. But if that's the extent you're willing to go for religious reporting, I think it's rather timid. And we need more people interested in reporting about religions they are unfamiliar with. And this is something I'm trying to apply more recently, because I'm very familiar with Christianity. I for those who don't know me, I did graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Biblical Exposition from Moody Bible Institute. I was training to be a pastor. I have an interdisciplinary in ancient literature. I can talk about Christianity till the cows come home. But I'm more interested in cults and religions in general, rather than just my specific niche. And part of that is we need less displaying personal biases in a grandstanding way or performative activism. So, religious trauma-informed therapy is the urgent need for individuals. That and Thankfully, there have been efforts in recent years to educate therapists on the specifics of religious trauma and how to address it. But in my worldview, it's a bit like an ER treatment. It's an emergency. We need to stop the bleeding of individuals in a metaphorical way. And religious trauma research, like what's being done here, is great, and it's needed to understand the importance and prevalence of a topic. But it's not necessarily a solution, and it's not necessarily the whole story. It's more a measurement tool that can be used to tell the whole story. So again, this is not an argument against therapy or research. This is just an argument on how we can practically stop religious trauma. And I think religious reporting holds accountable in an informed way the story of religious trauma. And that is all I got. So for Q&A, critique me, comment on me, do the counterpoints, or just say how great I am. I'm open to all of that.
Wonderful. John, thank you so much for this. It gave me some interesting insights and actually fed the wheel in my mind. Some different journalistic types of approaches to things. I definitely would disagree with some of the statements about religion. I think particularly with Islamists and the number of actual Islamists in the world. While the majority may not engage in suicide bombing themselves or funding, we are noticing that a good portion of Muslims around the world endorse attacks against non-believers. They just don't like the suicide bombing being done against other fellow Muslims. So I would argue that maybe there's still some, I think that there is some needed scrutiny. And and I guess maybe this is part of a dialogue I would like to have. I don't think journalists should ever be concerned about whether something is Islamophobic or anti-Semitic or whatever. I would much rather journalists just report facts, because facts are not even. They're not fair and balanced. And if the facts kind of appear to be Islamophobic, then I'm okay with that. Any thoughts on that?
I hear you. I think I'm hearing something a little different than how I would frame things. So what I agree with is that journalists have a duty. One of my favorite definitions of a journalist is, journalism, I should say, is a discipline of verification. So like a lot of what we are doing is trying to just figure out what's true and what's not. And increasingly in a world where there are a lot of misinformation campaigns, a lot of misinformation bots, and we have lawmakers who just swim in misinformation. It's definitely needed to be a verifier. But I would argue that journalists also cannot be robots, and they cannot be inhuman. They have a humanity about them that requires having opinions, that requires having stylistic direction, that requires them to tell stories. That's really what it is. And one of the slangs for journalists is we're part of the fourth estate. So part of our job is to keep powers accountable. One of the things that comes up when you have to keep a power accountable is you have to be precise, and the last thing you want to do is actually create more misinformation. So while I can understand what you're saying as far as the Islamists, some of that's not my field, because my field is American journalism to some extent. But I will say that a lot of those ideologies are not simply an Islamic ideology. There's a lot of other identities at play there. So it's not it's a fair critique, and I'll take it to heart. But I would caution. I would say journalists actually do need to be very, very, very aware of when they might be feeding into something that's hateful. Because if they don't, we've actually seen some really bad things come of that journalistically in the past 3 years of just because of giving too much attention to something that can feed into hate. I hear what you're saying as far as like the specific story. Like if I'm working on a story, I should not worry about if I'm going to be perceived as doing something hateful. I need to worry about the truth, but I need to be conscious with my word choice. I need to be conscious of exactly how I'm presenting the information. And I think a lot of bad journalism has been done because of a lack of knowledge of what certain word choices do.
Well, it just seems that journalists have gotten, at least the ones that I'm paying attention to the most, have gotten so concerned with being politically correct that they're missing the point of being a journalist. And
before, just so I know exactly what you're saying, can you define what you mean by you think they're being politically correct?
Well, I mean, if we were to say, I don't know if I can give a definition of politically correct other than policing thoughts and words so that it doesn't offend and hurt and walk on people. So if somebody were to report that a substantial number of Muslims are in fact supportive, indirectly of terrorism, it doesn't look good. If a newspaper were to come out and say this, and they're going to be perceived as inciting violence or hatred and Islamophobia, but the facts need to be communicated. So trying to, do some gymnastics to keep people from being offended, the very people to me who should be offending everyone are the journalists. And I think
this is going to be a strong disagreement actually, because what I'm talking about is not whether someone's offended. I'm talking about whether I need to understand enough about American culture to know that if I publish an article a certain way, it could result in a Muslim dying. And that's just the reality I have to bear as a journalist. So while I agree with you that we shouldn't care so much about, any kind of political framing, that isn't necessarily our job, although I'm fine with journalists having political slants personally. I don't see, as long as they're disclosed and not subtle, I think it's actually great to say these are my biases. But what I will say though is like, especially with some of the reporting that was done in the Trump years, it got really irresponsible really quick with giving too much attention, false equivalencies, all these like really bad practices. So I hear you. I hear the frustration of like, why can't we just say that this particular part of Islamic ideology is homophobic? And I actually agree with you that you should spell out very clearly how it is homophobic or how it is misogynistic. But it does need to be done in a particular way that does not encourage the hateful terrorists we have here to be hateful terrorists. But I do hear the complaint that could be, if you got too focused on that, it could affect your reporting in a bad way.
Well, I guess my pushback is I don't let religious zealots or fanatics in any strict shape or form dictate and police my thoughts and my words. So if my fear is that somebody's going to be killed because of a zealot, of a fanatic, right? And so they are in fact now in charge of the news. If that's how we approach this.
Well, not if you do reporting on those very same religious zealots. Because part of your job as a journalist is to pay attention to all of that. In fact, it could, in my opinion, a great way to deal with that is, let's say you're reporting on, recently there's been a lot of issues with the forced of head coverings internationally and trying to force American journalists to wear head coverings. And there's been some debate about, well, when are female journalists willing to put on the head covering? When are they not? Those kind of things. I think it's great to write about that. To say, I think it's abhorrent personally that I'm being forced to wear something, but I did because I wanted to report on this. I think that's a great story. And I think that's what's so important, is to keep in mind that you can tell a whole story in a way I'm not too concerned about offending people. My podcast is called The Cult of Christianity. I offend people all the time. I'm more concerned about like is if my reporting is doing a disservice to, let's say, a stereotype where, frankly, in American culture, I mean, I can a specific memory of several years ago. I was in urgent care, and there was a woman who was clearly Muslim based on how she was dressed. And this lady leans over to me and says, "Can you believe that her husband probably forces her to do that?" And that's bad. That's not an okay thing for us to talk about like that. We don't know this person. And that is to me the opposite of what journalism does. Journalism is actually trying to take that truth in a whole story way, not for the sake of being politically ambiguous or not offending people. It's more just to understand that stories are complicated and humans are complicated.
Interesting. I see Jeremy Schumacher, you have your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hey John, great presentation. I'm a therapist, so I was ready to like argue about something, but it was very well done. I'm curious kind of on your opinions on how can someone like me who's in the mental health field kind of pair with journalists or meet with journalists so that it can be a little bit more of a collaborative process. I think obviously there's a lot of journalism going on about the mental health crisis as well. So yeah, I was just curious if you could speak on that at all.
Yeah, thanks for doing the Lord's work. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I want there to be a relationship there. I don't know what it would look like. Because I think therapy, especially narrative focused therapy, right? Like it is actually very similar to what a journalist does in like a very almost like a profile is how I would think of it, right? Is like you're learning that person's story. And you are kind of parsing out some of those tricky parts, right? Like, um, is your trauma because of this? Is your trauma because of that? How does this sit with you? How does this identity sit with you? What are some of your fears? You get to explore someone's story like that. In some ways, that's kind of what we do with journalism, just oftentimes kind of on a more general thing. So what's funny is I feel like a lot of religious research gets has to go broad and then really specific. I feel like journalism has to go specific and really broad. And then I feel like therapy has this interesting thing where it doesn't really go from one to the other. It kind of just sticks with this very calm thing. So thank you for doing your work. I mean, just read a lot of, stories, especially if, you have a client who came from a particular, a specific cult or denomination or a specific religion, to just read what's been going on, because even if they've left that faith, if they're still in that faith, whatever it may be, they're probably thinking about it. They're probably thinking about what's been going on, and that might have something related. So I don't know. That's just off the top of my head, but yeah, thanks for the work you do. That's hard work. So thank you for doing it.
Let me ask one problem that I think we find on the ground level is journalists, and I feel like I've experienced this with both the larger journalists, for major news agencies, to independent journalists like yourself, that they want the sensationalist story. If you have whistleblowers or you have something going on, nobody pays attention to it because you're lowly Joe Schmo and you're not important. How can the average person who is experiencing religious trauma and has in fact identified their congregation as a cult, because we get this all the time, people saying, hey, I think I'm part of a cult. I think my church has gone full-blown bananas. Going to the media does nothing. They ignore it. They just don't have. Is there a way to break through?
Well, I hope so, because I'm trying to. Yeah, that's a great question. I am passionately against the sensationalization of news, and there is virtually no way around it. And that it comes back to some of my views of capitalism, to be frank. Because what happens with most journalists I know, and I know quite a handful, we're not we hate sensationalizing things as individuals. I mean, some of the bigger guys, yeah, they're, doing their thing. And there's kind of like this there was an era where the sensationalization thing was huge, and it's in American culture. I mean, it was very sensationalized in the beginning until things needed to be verified better. Um, we don't usually like making someone's trauma like fun or like catchy. It's usually, a lot of journalists, we talk about the cry in the car. Because a lot of times you'll interview people and then you'll go to your car and cry because you don't want to cry during the interview. Um, I there's so much good so many good things you said. Um, I think there's a couple things that happen when you're talking about someone who's whistleblowing on their church. One, a lot of journalists are very afraid of religious reporting. The bigger guys, obviously, there's people like me and my mentor who like specialize in it. So this is our beat. In journalism, we call it the God beat. We're fine with reporting on religion, but if you don't have a lot of religious knowledge, you're worried about that minefield of screwing up and saying something wrong and causing more harm than you could prevent. And I do push back against that. I think that is bad. And so, yeah, for me, that's a lot of why I believe in boots on the ground. Instead of waiting around for a whistleblower, I'm going to go to a church, I'm going to go to a cult, and I'm going to ask the followers what's going on. And I'm going to ask the leaders what's going on. And yeah, I think that's really bad. But the whole sensationalization thing, it's usually not the journalists themselves. It's usually the economic incentives. No one's going to click on your article without a good headline. No one's going to read past Senate, the second paragraph if it's not exciting. And if they don't do that, it doesn't make any money. If it doesn't make any money, journalism's gone. So that, I think that's really where the issue comes in as far as like journalists go. If you're talking about New York Times and like these big outlets, I mean, they're big business, and so they do what big businesses do.
Well, it's interesting. You identify a fear of getting something wrong in the God beat as something that makes them avoidant. It's I chuckle, and you'll have to forgive me. I have the utmost respect for the ideals of journalism. I'm not so sure I have much respect for journalism anymore. I have the ideals I love, and I love what it's supposed to be doing. But having been intimately involved with a number of top stories in both newspaper and on the nightly news. And I'm talking, past careers and stuff in law enforcement and other things. Journalists not only routinely get things wrong, it's almost as if they don't give a shit that they got things wrong. So I chuckle when I hear you say they don't want to get something wrong.
Where most mistakes happen in journalism?
Please tell.
Editors.
Really?
Because most things are cut down for time space. Cable news is everyone knows that cable news is the worst news there is. And sometimes it's not actually because of the sense of trying to make everything sensational. A lot of times it's because we have 2 minutes. Let's talk about the Middle East. What is 2 minutes to talk about the Middle East? Of course it's going to be bad. So if you're going to make it engaging at it, or even remotely like worth watching, you're going to get the more extreme shouty people from each end of whatever spectrum. So cable news is, I mean, I don't watch cable news. I only read, and a lot of stuff that my colleagues read, I don't read because I'm not going to read that. So I'm very critical of a lot of journalists. And I think there's a lot of bad journalism. But when it comes to the religious stuff, I think there is a genuine fear among the journalists that they're like, man, if I go in there and say they believe this and then I'm wrong, because like it's hard if you didn't come from a religious background, if it is hard to understand what the heck anyone's talking about. Because there's so many layers of like sociology, history that are behind everything. So at least on the journalists themselves, I think that's where a lot of problems happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually can see that in a number of other areas outside of journalism where you get too many cooks in the kitchen, kind of a thing. So I get it to an extent. Let me ask you, you had mentioned something about Trump supporters being themselves religious trauma sufferers. Do you think that the insurrection on January 6th is that there might be a direct line connecting religious trauma and the insurrection?
Well, yeah, abusers have trauma. I'm very confident in saying that. Very few people who abuse were not abused themselves. Um, and to me, having trauma makes you human. It doesn't excuse your behavior. So, yeah, I would say so. Frankly, I think there's even more trauma at play than religious trauma when we get to something like January 6th. Um, I think there's a lot of actually it's layered. I mean, a lot of things have to happen for something like a insurrection attempt. So yeah, I think religious trauma plays a part. Um, but yeah, I say yes, but I don't say, the Trump supporters who have terrorists who have religious trauma don't get much sympathy from me. But I think it would be almost foolish to say in a situation like that there was no religious trauma at play.
Yeah, interesting. Clearly, it's a perfect storm of a whole bunch of things, for sure. I want to explore this for myself. The notion of maybe failed prophecies or a persecution syndrome and things like that at play to create religious trauma and then a lashing out. Will you do me a favor? So I think a lot of people are very interested in your podcast, some of the stories and journalism. So please tell me some of the things that you've been covering, especially with cult practices and all that kind of stuff. What happens on your show?
Yeah, so the show is interesting. It's kind of where I started. And I'll kind of via plug, I suppose. If y'all want to learn more, see it for yourself, thecultofchristianity.com. It started as a book that I wrote in 2019 when I was homeless and living in a van and had just left my faith. And it is not that good of a book. But the good news is it became a good podcast, because in the process of creating a podcast to promote a book, I found I actually like podcasting a lot more than trying to be an academic, because I'm not. I'm a journalist. And what I've found is I interview all kinds of people. I interview cult survivors. I interview religious experts. I love interviewing Christians when they agree to come on. It's kind of hard to get them on every now and then, but I've interviewed some pastors, and that's always fun. And what I'm really trying to do with that podcast is talk about Christianity in a cult framing. And the reason I use that framing is it's simply what I think it is. And I think that's really important um, to critique the cultishness of Christianity, because what I find happens when I do that is the critiques are actually clearer and in less religious jargon. So I like to do that. That's what I've done with the podcast. What that did is it got me into NYU because it did so well, and I was interested in going farther. So NYU took me in, and I've been working on the God Beat from day one, because in journalism school you don't wait around. You just start doing journalism, and your professors are your editors, and you learn journalism by doing it. So I've been working on many stories at once. One will unfortunately probably take a couple of years for it to be published, because it's a big story, so I can't talk too much about that one. But some other things I'm working on, I went to the Church of Scientology fairly recently, trying to get recruited, seeing how their recruiting practices were. Tomorrow I'm going to the International House of Prayer here in Atlanta to figure out what's going on there. And then I do a lot of watchdogging. So I'm on a Christianity Broadcasting Network. I'm on them a lot, just seeing what they're saying, figuring out where the misinformation is, tracking down where their rumors originate, those kind of things, and also just exploring all that. So I do a little bit of everything, but most of my reporting thus far has been the cultish practices of Christian.
That's great. What any surprising trends that you're seeing on the cult circuit?
We're
in this day and age, we know classic cult patterns for sure.
Mhm.
Anything in this day and age, especially post-Trump era, maybe, or on the verge of AI kind of stuff, any kind of cult things that you're noticing?
Yeah, I've actually been talking about this AI thing for a while. Or not a while, but with a lot of people in recent months. We are, first off, culturally, both globally and specifically with the US, we are ripe for new cults. So there's going to be things that I will hear about very soon that have not even been created yet. We are just ripe for cult leaders right now. The biggest thing I think I see is frankly just the economic situation. It makes people desperate for, does it ever get better? When you're under the boot, when you're under the thumb, you are looking for any way out because it's really hard to pull you. It's dare I say impossible in the US at least to get yourself out of some really bad financial situations. There's not much opportunity. You know, wages don't go up, but expenses do. That's one simple one, but there's many other factors. So if you want hope, you got to hope in an afterlife, or you got to hope in a community, or you got to hope in a person who has this brand new idea that's actually, a 2,000-year-old idea repackaged. So yeah, we are definitely in a situation where I think I'm going to be very busy in the next few years.
That's interesting. Yeah. I'm reminded of that old proverb, may you live in interesting times. And I'm now I'm not so sure. So that's exactly it. It looks like David Fitzgerald, do you have a question that you want to ask?
Well, actually, I'd kind of like to take it offline because it's not something everybody really interested in. But there's a new cult up here in Northern California. It's got this very Harry Potterish name, Bethel School of Supernatural Ministries, and they're extremely creepy. And I'm just curious if they were on his radar, and if not, I would like to put them on his radar.
Well, they are now, so I'm on it.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Great talk.
Thanks.
Well, I will open it up for one or two more questions or comments. And if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and close out this session. Okay, I think we're good to go. John, thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate your insight and your perspective on this. It's a unique thing to get a journalist's take and viewpoint on some of these things that, well, as an academic, as historians, philosophers, theologians, and stuff, we're coming at this from way different angle than to hear from your side. I think it was much needed, very, very good. So thank you so much for doing this. And thank you, everybody, for coming out. We still have more presentations coming up. John, I'll let you have the final word.
Yeah, real quick. Henry, did you have a question? I thought I saw a hand real quick. I'd hate to cheat you out of a question.
Yeah, no, I was curious as to whether you've had experience talking with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, they come to your door, so yes. But yeah, I've talked to a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses too. Yeah, I mean, pretty boilerplate cult stuff. Kind of always has been. Hasn't really, there's a lot of Christians who would call JWs cultists. One of the I'll end on this. So one of the things I do, everyone has different definitions for cults, what it even means, and different models and such. Where I landed through pure accident, pure guessing, and where I think, and it's gotten me this far, is I define cults by three. I used to be a pastor, so I had to have 3 C's. There's control, contain, and convert. And the other marker of a cult is a distinction between leaders and followers. And so my definition for a cult is when leaders control, contain, and convert followers. And just really briefly, control, Stephen Hassan has done a lot of great work on the different kinds of ways that cults control. Contain is a lot of where the us versus theming goes. Don't go outside. We've got it right. They'll hurt you out there. And then conversion isn't always like an evangelical version of conversionism where it's, convert the whole world. But there's always a mechanism. There's always a way. There's no such thing as a single person cult. There's a way to convert people. And so when I'm evaluating religions and cults, that's how I go through it. For me to feel good about calling something a cult, it has to meet that criteria. For me, I'm not familiar with any version of Jehovah's Witness that is not cultish.
I definitely agree it's a cult. When I was a Jehovah's Witness, and when I left, I ended up in therapy because I was trying to figure out how to create a worldview and what values I was going to take on. And the therapist community were totally out of touch with my needs. They weren't not able to help me at all. And it was left for me to figure that out.
Yeah, I'm so glad things have gotten better on that front with it when it comes to therapy. But yeah, there's still a lot of therapists who don't realize how triggering for an ex-cult survivor. Yes, seculartherapy.org is great. Who don't always recognize that there is that what a therapist can do for someone can actually be really triggering just in how they approach a topic. I've had a therapist ask me to meditate before. And meditation for me feels a lot like prayer. So that was actually really hard. And the therapist had no ill will. It's just that kind of like not equipped to deal with it. So I'm glad there's been great strides made that way. But I'm sorry. Yeah, that's rough when you're trying to get help and it doesn't help.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Henry, I wanted to say, thank you for chiming in on about that. We actually are in touch with so many current and former Jehovah's Witnesses because of just how damaging, just how pervasive the religious trauma is. So just know that you're not alone. I want you to know that. John, final word.
Thanks. If you like the sound of my voice, or if you want to find something to argue about me with, you can go to thecultofchristianity.com. Listen to the podcast. There's some great stories. If you're looking for something more sensational, one episode I have is about a guy who was kidnapped by Christians. It's under that title, Kidnapped by Christians. If you're looking for something more topical, I've covered a lot of topics in regards to how Christianity can engage in very cultish practices. So if that interests you, go check it out, and stay tuned for a lot of reporting to come out very soon. I'm working on a lot of crazy stories, and I can't wait for them to break. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast or other work I'm doing, go to thecultofchristianity.com. If you'd like to support this podcast, listen, follow, share, and consider subscribing for $5 through Spotify for additional content, or give as much or as little as you can to support this work through links in the show's notes. Every dollar helps further this important discussion as well as start other exciting projects. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep love in your life, hope in your heart, and searching in your soul.